You're all very welcome to the May Mentor Forum. To those of you who are new to the forum, you're very welcome, and to those of you who've joined again, you're also very welcome. We started the forum back in March, where we had an overview of scoring quarterly reports, and last month in April we did a review of what assessors look for in the application form that's submitted by IMechE and CMechE applicants. We also did a brief update on the changes to Career Developer. At this forum, we've got 3 speakers to introduce you today, and we're going to be taking a look at a couple of different things. But as I said earlier, please do use the chat box to post any questions that you may have. That would be really helpful, and we can deal with them then at the end. So what we're going to look at today, I'm going to shortly pass over to my colleague Alison and introduce her, and she's going to look at communication styles across the generations. My colleague Emma is going to do an overview of the career learning assessment pathway, and Anne and I are going to share the inside track on professional review interview. We should finish in about 40-45 minutes so that there's enough time to have questions from all of you attendees here today. And ultimately, the goal of the forum is really so that you have additional resources as a mentor, perhaps as a sponsor, as a scheme administrator, to add to your mentoring toolkit, and also perhaps to share with your colleagues within your own organisation as well. So a copy of the slides and a summary of the questions and answers will be circulated after the event today. If you weren't able to attend previous forums and you want a copy of those slides, please just let me know. Just drop me an email, please, and I can send them on to you. So I'm just about to pass over to Alison, but before I do so, please let me introduce Alison. Alison is our Alison Roberts is our Senior Program Manager, Leadership and Management with the L&D team at IMechE. She's an award-winning trainer with over 30 years experience in coaching, mentoring and training across a huge variety of different industry sectors. In her spare time, Alison supports the Innovation to Commercialization of University Market Validation Programme with STEM research teams. And as it happens, Alison had very kindly agreed to travel to Aberdeen last year for an event we were planning in March, but unfortunately COVID put paid to those travel plans. So I'm really delighted that she can join us here today. So thanks very much, Alison, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and thanks for the lovely intro, and welcome everybody this morning. So I'm going to keep this brief and then we'll take some questions at the end. And next slide, please, Sandra. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about millennials, what makes them similar, and how we can use coaching to build rapport across all the generations. So next slide, please, Sandra. So what's interesting about this slide is that millennials are actually defined as those being born between 81 and 97, and you can see there that by this year they make up around 75% of our workforce. So that means that this year they'll be in the 24 to 40-year-old range. Now Gen Z are hot on their heels. They're born between 97 and 2015, and they are currently around 6 to 24 years old this year. So they are now making up, in that older age range, 59% of our workforce, and that's why it's incredibly important to gain a deeper understanding of where they're coming from and how we can best support them in the workplace. So there is actually a Gen Alpha, believe it or not. They're the tech-savvy young children of millennials, and the word is, in research papers and in many of the trends that I'm reading up on, that they could soon make Gen Z an afterthought. These are the real rising stars. So where do we start? Next slide, please, Sandra. So this was a really interesting piece of research which was done by IBM. So I want to draw your attention, first of all, to the left-hand side, 66% of millennials And hopefully this will give us the context that we're often lacking in some of the behaviours that we see with millennials. Now look to the bottom right, 70% of baby boomers. So let's think about this in terms of millennials. For example, if they have high expectations of their own customer service experience, they will be focused on translating that across the organisation. So if your customer service experience is not up to scratch, they will get frustrated, and that frustration can manifest itself in a number of different ways. So for example, let's take your technology. If your systems are slow or out of date, or you haven't got the latest software, they will have a perception that you're not moving with the times. And I can understand that, because in their minds, these things can add up and create a feeling that an organisation is not as agile or as responsive as it could be, therefore not giving customers the service that they expect and deserve. And in millennials' minds, it means that those customers will be tempted to go elsewhere, just as they have done if they haven't received the level of service that they are accustomed to having. And this is quite an important slide, because it shows us as well that the generational differences that we have been fed by the media are not wholly correct. So if you look to the 47% there on the right, millennials actually want to stay where they are, where they feel valued, where they can do their best work, and that's the same for all of us. So how can we best support these various different generations? Next slide, please, Sandra. So here we see a piece of research by Pricewaterhouse. Don't get me wrong, there are differences in the generations. On this slide, we can see more boomers, and this is the case, embracing technology and more agile ways of working. One thing that all generations look for is congruence. What that means is agreement, harmony, or compatibility. So let's draw on millennials specifically. One of the key things is that they are driven, and they must believe in and have embedded within them a strong sense of purpose. They are passionate about making a difference. And I want you to think back, I'm 58, and I can remember when I was that age, I was exactly the same. You know, it was very important to me to make a difference, to do meaningful work, and to have a career that's worth my time and effort. And that is what millennials today are looking for. So again, you can see that perhaps if that was you when you were younger, we're not that much different. Now, authenticity is extremely important to millennials and Gen Zs. When they believe in a mission, they will commit their creativity and energy to it wholeheartedly. But the organisational message must be credible to earn their buy-in at this level. And this is where I would say to you, is your message congruent? Is it shared openly with the organisation? And do you uphold your organisation's mission and values in everything that you say and do? Because that will earn you the respect and the buy-in of your younger workforce. Of course, they want to be part of a community. That's partly because they have grown up with social media. They want to be associated with something that represents their values. And of course, they're also mobile natives. They've been using a smartphone since they were young at school, unlike us, and many of them have never even had a landline. Are you familiar with the capacity of your smartphone and what it does? Find out how this younger generation are using it. They do everything on the go. They're banking, there are apps for them to build apps, you know, to train themselves. There is so much that they do in a mobile way now. So what do you know about that? And are you able to carry on a conversation around that to support building rapport with that younger generation? And they want to be recognised. Of course, money is nice, but they want to be publicly acknowledged for the work that they achieve, and they do work very, very hard. So I would direct you here to Dan Pink, who has a great talk on motivation, which is all around autonomy, purpose, and mastery. So there's a lot more that I could go through with you, but in the interest of time, let's move to the next slide, Sandra. Thank you. So what can we do? So more and more organisations that I speak to now, people like Dyson, Ericsson, JCB, Network Rail, they are all taking a coaching approach to leadership and communication. So rather than these traditional management roles, there is now a coaching approach. They offer frequent two-way feedback and encourage reflective practice. Now, one of the best ways you can do that is to use the stop, start, continue and change model. Use it on yourself and use it on your team. One of the best things that you can do is to listen. And in order to do that, you need to be fully present. When you listen at that level, you'll be able to pick up subtext from many of the conversations that you would otherwise miss. And lastly, be curious, ask questions. So last slide, please, Sandra. So as someone who delivers a lot of training, I often see a lot of costly leadership quotes that I'm kind of fed up of quoting, actually. So I pulled this one from a millennial, and I think it's really powerful. I think we need to look at what we have in common whilst embracing our differences. I also believe that as leaders, it's up to us to make the changes that we want to see and lead the way. Because no matter what generation we're from, we all want to contribute, make a difference and lead the world in a better way than when we found it. So thank you for having me here today, Sandra, and I will take questions afterwards.
Thanks very much, Alison. That was really interesting, some really good food for thought, and I can certainly relate to the comment on a personal level about the phone. The amount of times my 13-year-old takes my phone off me and fiddles with it and suddenly makes it much better and quicker and easier to do stuff. So I think we all learn lessons in that way as well. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you, Alison, but we'll keep the questions to the end if that's okay, if you wouldn't mind. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Emma. Emma is, like myself, one of the business development managers. Emma is based in Merseyside and specialises in career learning assessment for experienced engineers, sitting outside of the Engineering Council entry requirements. She holds a BEng honours degree in civil engineering from Salford University and a master's in sustainable development, energy and management. And prior to joining the institution, Emma worked in the water and nuclear industries, and since joining IMechE, she's worked across all sectors with a special focus on nuclear and defence. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Hi, good afternoon. My name's Emma Guy, and I'm going to talk to you about career learning assessment. Some of you may have heard of this, others may have actually supported people through this route, and there may be some of you on the call who are not quite sure what it means. So we'll cover all that as we go through. Could you move over to the next slide, please, Sandra? Thank you. So what career learning assessment does is it offers an opportunity for an individual to work towards Engineering Council registration if they sit outside of the Engineering Council entry requirements. The standard for that would be, say somebody had a bachelor's degree, they would generally be suitable after 3 years development to work towards incorporated engineer. If we're looking at chartered, we're looking at 4 years plus a relevant master's degree. However, we recognise that there are so many good engineers out there who maybe came through the apprentice route or haven't had the opportunity to go to university, or maybe their path through was a little bit different. So this route will be suitable for somebody in that situation. It's very difficult to put a timeline on this because a lot of people ask, how many years experience should we have? But as we know, we all learn at very different paces and we're all involved at completely different depths. Just as a guide though, if we say somebody has held a technical engineering role for at least 7 years, it might be that they're suitable for this. And the best way to check is to speak to one of us at the IMechE, and we can have a chat with them and talk about their experience. With the IMechE application, you can make application through CLA for IMechE or CMechE. And again, they're assessed at the same levels. However, we're looking for, rather than that degree certificate, understanding and knowledge at or above bachelor's level or master's level. One area where this may prove a little bit difficult, and it's probably better to look somewhere else, and again speak to us about that, is if the applicant has actually moved into a managerial role, and that means that they've been taken away from the technical day job, even overseeing and signing off, for around maybe 10 years, because they will then find the 2 technical questions on this a little bit too difficult to approach. Next slide, please, Sandra. So as an overview, what we're looking at here is, instead of your academics, we're looking at your experience. Now, this causes some issue for people who first read the application here, and I will go through some hints and tips on how to complete it. But essentially what we're doing is, rather than assessing your competence, we're assessing your learning. So we're looking at your experience and what you've learned and how you learned that. Generally, that will be unstructured. So it's not necessarily that you've gone away and studied a subject. It might be that you've been thrown in at the deep end and had to learn pretty quickly. You've probably done some research. You'll have worked with colleagues or on joint ventures with other people. You might even worked with suppliers or contractors, and that's how you've gained the knowledge that you've got today. What will happen with regards to the application, if anybody does have any particular areas of study, so courses that they've achieved, whether that's a formal course or whether they've worked with a supplier for 5 days on a new pressure vessel, all of that can count, as well as work-based research. So just to reiterate, we're not looking here for the standard entry requirements. What we're saying is that somebody might have very relevant experience in a particular area, so let's take them outside of the direct application and see if we can help them through another route. Next slide, please, Sandra. The process is a little bit different. Most of you will recognise the bottom half of the page. So once you've got somebody who has completed their bachelor's or their master's degree, you'll be looking at direct application to IMechE or CMechE after that initial development period. That will be then followed on by the professional review interview, which you're going to talk about again this afternoon. Those 2 things still take place and they are part of the process. Please make a note though that at the PRI we will only be assessing you on your IMechE or your CMechE application. It will not contain any of the CLA work that you've done or anything from your CLA application whatsoever. So that bottom half of the page is exactly the same as you would do with anybody from MPDS or any other route that you've mentored through. What needs to happen in addition is, in order to prove against the benchmark from both the Engineering Council UK spec and the IMechE requirements, what we look at is a 2-step process for CLA. So the first part is a very small part. It's the eligibility checker, and applicants will be advised to complete that on their own and send that directly into IMechE. It shouldn't take too long or be too onerous. CLA 2, that's the main chunk of this. CLA 2 is around 80% of your CLA process, and it is the part that requires the most effort, the most focus, and because of that, we offer application workshops and we can run reviews on your application prior to formal submission. So of that whole process, it's very likely that CLA 2 will be the most difficult for the applicant and they will need the most support in that area. It is very achievable though. The reason it's so difficult, you'll see in a second when we move on, is just because of the way things are worded. Next slide, please, Sandra. So with CLA, the assessors are looking for something slightly different to competence. And if you see in bold at the bottom of the page there, how do you know this? That is something that the applicant should keep asking themselves as they write their application. Because rather than us looking for a list of tasks or of successful completed projects, that's not what we want. What we want to know is, what did you learn? How do you know this? So what did you learn while you were working on those tasks that you're keen to tell us about? So one really good hint and tip for how to approach this, particularly for the initial brainstorming, is to draw up on a page 3 columns. On the right-hand side, if you write down what you would normally see as competence, so the outcomes, the project, the process or the task that was achieved, in the centre of the page, you can write down what you did to actually get there, and then work back to the left of the page. What did you actually learn? How did you know this? So again, it's that competence that we're not looking for at this stage. Instead, we're looking for the learning. Next slide, please, Sandra. Thank you. And learning subject ideas, we do ask people to go very, very technical on a deep level for question 1 and question 2. And that's why I said a couple of slides ago that it's probably not very suitable for someone who's been in a managerial position for some time, because we will want detail. We will be looking for example, advanced thermodynamics. Can you take us down to first principles? Can you talk about all of the detail, any testing, any research that you had to do? Give me some numbers, quantify. What were the constraints? What was the tolerance? Were there any limitations? This is the area that we're going to head with CLA 2. So somebody needs to have experience in a technical area. Next slide, please, Sandra. Thank you. This slide is very, very small, I appreciate, so thank you, Sandra, for blowing it up a little bit. This is something that I ask applicants to actually go away and do some research on for themselves. However, it's here today just to give you an idea of the kind of things and the subject areas that we're looking for. So what I've done is I've just gone away and got downloaded a course for a master's degree in mechanical engineering. Now, it might be that the applicant will need or will be better suited to go and find something more specific to their skill set. But if you have a look at the modules available, I've broken down a couple at the bottom. So if someone is working on fatigue, or it might be failure assessment diagrams, then fantastic. Let's work on structural integrity, and let's talk about your depth of knowledge and understanding in structural integrity. How did you learn that? Where did that knowledge come from? You don't just wake up one day and it's there. How, over the years, have you gained the level of understanding and experience that you have today? And that's what we work with on somebody when they're working towards their CLA 2 application. Next slide, please, Sandra. The application itself covers 5 questions, so it does mirror UK spec when we're looking at competence. However, again, please remember this isn't competence. We're looking for something slightly different. So let's put UK spec on the backbench while an applicant is working on CLA. The first 2 questions are technical, and that's what I've just covered very briefly there. We will be looking at those subject areas. We then have another 3 questions which cover the day job. So it's almost mimicking CD&E, where we're looking at your health and safety. Have you done any additional training? What's your understanding on project management? Have you managed teams? All of those kinds of questions. So we're just preparing and making sure that somebody will also be suitable for the next stage of application. We do require more writing at CLA. So you'll recognise here that we're looking at between 500 and 1,000 words per question. And 3 of those questions, there will be self-assessment as well. But again, that's why we offer the application workshops and a lot of guidance from the business development team. We wouldn't expect somebody to go through this on their own, and obviously you would be their first port of call to ask for support as well. Next slide, please, Sandra. As with most applications that come through, words to avoid. If you're If your applicant is looking at using words like liaise or I was involved in, they don't really tell us what they do. It's that very much, I suppose it's that LinkedIn jargon where you can write a whole paragraph and it means absolutely nothing. It doesn't tell you or tell the reader what you actually did. So it's a reminder to make sure that all applications that come our way, whether CLA or something else, that they are very specific. Rather than reviewing a drawing, what did you do? What were you looking for? What were you checking? Next slide, please, Sandra. And finally, just some hints and tips for question 1 and question 2, mostly because they are the most difficult for people to get their head around. 50% of applicants do head down the route of competence. So we just need to keep reminding them and saying, actually, no, what we want here is your learning. Tell me about your learning. It's very important that applicants don't make assumptions. If they skip or expect us to read between the lines, we're not going to. So if they haven't told us something, we're not going to assume that they know it. And again, we are looking to understand how they acquired that knowledge, not just what they actually did, not the task that they carried out. What we can do with this is the application form actually leads somebody through into expanding and explaining what it is that they know, but it's very much up to them to make sure that they tell us how they learned it. And we stress that all the way through because it's very easy to forget. So CLA is there, it's available for applicants. I'm sure you know colleagues or other people within your company who would be suitable for this. It is there, it's just a little bit more work, but we're more than happy to help. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. I'd say it's particularly relevant to perhaps mentors who've been mentoring developing engineers who had planned to do further learning and for whatever reason never quite got around to doing further learning or perhaps completing their individual further learning plan.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we all have people who, you know, life gets in the way, careers get in the way, you get promoted into a different job, everything's a little bit too busy, and before you know it, quite a few years have gone by. So further learning and CLA are both options that are suitable for people who sit somewhere in the middle. It might be that further learning suits somebody at the earlier career stage, or it might be that it suits that manager who's actually moved further on into more management. But CLA, if you've still got the technical understanding and knowledge, then yes, it's perfect for that.
Great, thanks very much, Emma. I'm sure there'll be questions to follow shortly. I would suggest, though, if anybody in the call today listening in has got a colleague that they're looking for some advice in relation to CLA, if you get in touch with our colleague Jacqueline via bdm@imeche.org, she will put you in contact with the relevant business development manager local to you who'll be able to help you. So thank you very much, Emma. That was really helpful. Anne is with us today as well. Anne, I'm hoping you won't have any technical issues and you can get your camera to work so you can join us. Before Anne joins us, a brief introduction. Anne has spent many years managing maintenance on various assets, including chemical plants, manufacturing lines, and on and offshore oil and gas production facilities, including the Brent field. She was working laterally in strategic roles, reviewing projects globally and driving reliability. And Anne has a strong track record in stakeholder engagement, building relationships, and leading teams through both technical, behaviour and organisational change programmes. She's currently retired, but kept busy leading a community campaign to save a historic bridge, serving on the Community Council, and also as an IMechE facilitator. So thanks very much for joining us today, Anne. Great, super, thank you. Good to see you there. So the slides we've put together to share with you this afternoon, we're going to go through them briefly, but as I said at the start, it's some detail included in them so that you'll have them as a resource to refer back to after today. So the slides we've put together have been as a result of liaising with other professional review interviews, facilitators, and IMechE HQ staff. So very much focusing on the professional review interview in terms of when things go right, what we look for, and equally, unfortunately, what happens when things go wrong. And We're fortunate in that the success rate at interview is over 90%. The vast majority of people are successful. However, when somebody is not successful, I think it's fair to say that the impact can be pretty devastating on that individual and often on their mentor and their colleagues within their organisation. So the next few slides we'll share with you will give you some tips on what we look for to ensure success and equally what to avoid. So just to recap from last month very briefly, if you put yourself into the panelists' perspective, they've got quite a lot of work to do before they actually meet the interview applicant, quite a lot of reading to do. Each interview lasts 45 minutes to an hour, and then as a facilitator, you've got quite a lot of work to do, Anne, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah, in terms of preparation, there's heaps to do because as a facilitator, you want to know all about the candidates before you meet them. So there is a bit of work done in terms of going through the application, making sure you understand what the candidate does, what their background is, and what role they play within a team. So that's really sort of one of the main involvements. But also, as a facilitator, you need to make sure the panel are up to speed as well. And that's another check to make sure that the panel are coming into the PRI as prepared as you as the facilitator are. And indeed, if one of the panel doesn't show up, then the facilitator will step in and take over so that the interview can still go ahead.
And then you've got to ensure that you send all the correct paperwork back to our colleagues after the day as well, don't you, Anne?
Yes. We try to complete the paperwork between each interview so that the information is fresh in our minds and we've got a very clear picture of the candidate in our heads. So that the panel complete the paperwork, the interview facilitator then has to check the paperwork and add another paragraph just about the interview, how it went, how the candidates felt afterwards. We are always keen to get feedback from the candidate on how they felt the interview went. And we capture that because it's good for the panel to know that that last candidate, for example, really enjoyed the session. They had a great time talking about themselves and they felt like they got to tell the panel everything they wanted to. That's kind of the feedback that we're looking for. What we absolutely don't want, and we work quite hard not to get actually, is that the candidate felt grilled. No, it's really not supposed to be an interrogation. It's a chat among peers. And so getting that feedback from the candidate is another part of the facilitator's role, making sure that's captured on the paperwork before it goes back into the IMechE.
Great. And then moving on to look at when we have good candidates. There's lots of common traits amongst good candidates, which we'll go through briefly with you. They tend to interact well. They recognise and realise that it's not an interview, it's more of a discussion amongst peers. They've a good understanding of their career, their experience, and how that maps against the competence requirements. Most importantly, they've prepared well for the professional review interview. The professional review interview is a lot like a professional business meeting, and we all tend to find the more you prepare, the more effort you put into preparing that for that big meeting, that presentation, that pitch to a new client, the better it will tend to go for you. Good applicants also understand how they meet the competence requirements. And bear in mind, it's only a maximum of about 60 minutes duration. So most people will say it's the quickest 45 to 60 minutes of their lives. They tend to find it absolutely flies by. And you tend to notice applicants, they will initially be a little bit nervous. You can see sort of their shoulders are up. And as the interview progresses, you can see the shoulders drop down, they're relaxing, they're talking about their career. And there's very few opportunities in life where you can talk about your career and what you've achieved in front of an interested audience. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to those points, Anne.
Just really that I think that one of the key points is that if the candidate has examples to talk about, then it's helpful for them because they clearly fully understand it was their job, it was them who did it. They have a deep understanding of the example, and it's also very useful for the panel in that it gives them something specific to hang on to. So rather than sort of giving maybe a more textbooky, we maybe come to this in a moment, but the key thing is for real examples to be described in interview, and that really makes a difference to the panel.
And I think the supporting documents can make the interview more interesting for the panel as well, and a little bit easier for the applicant.
Yes, I think it takes the pressure off the applicant a little bit. Notice even in the face-to-face interviews, if a drawing is put on the table or up on the screen virtually, everybody leans in. Oh, what's this about? You know, there is a natural curiosity, a natural desire to understand. And that's very helpful for the panel as well as the candidate, because for a moment the pressure comes off the candidate a bit. They start maybe to see the interviewers or the panel more as peers and a bit less as, you know, people who are actually going to formally make a judgment on them. So it's really important, I think, to share examples, but only relevant examples and only in the moment. What we absolutely don't want is somebody put the example up on the screen, which sometimes happens, and then everybody's chatting about it and they forget to take it down. And that's a pity, because we lose the interaction with the candidate, and we very much want that as well. So it's, yeah, share the example and then take it down.
Okay, so some of the traits of the good interviews on the screen at the moment, and some food for thought for you to think about in advising developing engineers. Moving on then to have a look at the not so good. This is the stuff that we really don't like, but happens occasionally. First thing is applicants not speaking in the first person, so talking about we, the company, the team, etc., rather than speaking in the first person. That's something that comes up time and time and time again. Sometimes we get applicants who are trying to bamboozle the panel with their technical knowledge, not necessarily being aware that perhaps the interview panel or a member of the interview panel is far more expert than the interviewee, so that tends not to go terribly well. Too many extra props, poor understanding of the competencies, and unwillingness to answer or engage in conversation. That's perhaps the applicant who knows deep down in their heart and soul that they're borderline in terms of having enough evidence for A and B, and it's just a very difficult interview. I think that's fair to say, Anne, isn't it?
Yes, I think the questions on the application form for each of the competencies are very helpful. And if candidates can have examples that relate to some of those questions so that they can then describe them, it's very helpful, you know, for getting across their point. But there's also a little bit, and I see this a fair bit among engineers, is that they tend to be a little understated. They almost sometimes take for granted the work that they do and think that actually it's maybe not as meaningful as it actually is in reality, because they do it every day and they're surrounded by people who do it. It becomes, you know, maybe a little bit mundane to them, but it's not to the interview panel. So there is something about not underselling yourself, making sure that, for example, when you're asked about any sort of theoretical work that's been done, you know, I have seen candidates say, no, I haven't done anything, no, I haven't done calculations, no, I haven't, you know, and then the panel try very hard, probing in different directions to try and find some theoretical experience that the candidate has had, and sadly move on thinking, well, we didn't find it. And then towards the end of the interview, the candidate will say something, and I've had this, the candidate would say, yeah, well, when I was doing the calculations for such and such, and I say, whoa, hang on, we were looking for work, that you were doing theoretical work or doing some calculations or using software packages earlier on in the interview, but you know, the candidate maybe had a block, you know, a blind spot, whatever, and then it comes out right at the end. So it is very helpful if the candidates can open their mind to the work that they're doing and appreciate how it relates to the competencies. If they can do that before they come in, I think there's less chance of them missing giving examples or experience that they have.
I think you've led very nicely into another tip, is that if the interview panel asks a question and you answer it, and then they come back with a similar question, that's normally a hint that you just haven't given them enough information first time round, and they're back there because they need you to give them more information so that they can award you the score that you need in order to be successful. We often get candidates as well who look very good on paper and then just don't come across well during the face-to-face interview because their nerves are obviously getting the better for them. Now, if you're mentoring somebody where you feel that's going to be an issue, we would recommend that you try and do a mock interview, but we normally recommend that you as a sponsor don't do the mock interview. Get another colleague who doesn't know the applicant to do the mock interview for them, because that can really help to reassure them and help them prepare for a successful interview. And sometimes it can be very hard work for the interview panel extracting enough evidence for competence A and B from the interview panel, sorry, from the applicant.
I think that can be particularly the case with candidates who are from bigger corporations where perhaps some of the specialised work tends to be contracted out, but quite often there's somebody checking that and making sure it's being done properly to codes or whatever. But also if a candidate has moved up and has become a little more senior within their organisation, they might have to go back in time to provide evidence of the competencies that we're looking for in A and B. So it's, while a candidate might be in a big strategic important role, that doesn't get them chartership. No, they have to be demonstrating some technical capability as well, and that's work that they've often done earlier in their career. So they must be prepared to go back there and to describe some of that work as well.
So that's a very brief summary of when things aren't going terribly well during the interview. Next bit is where we really don't want to go and where we really want to avoid with professional review interview applicants. And I think it's fair to say that something that it's generally avoided. You can see I've included an image there to try and get the message across to everybody. But unfortunately, for about 8% of applicants, they do end up here, which is why we're covering it today, to try and avoid your developing engineers ending up there. So this is when things go wrong. And this is when, during the course of the interview, it becomes obvious to the interview panel that there are, in fact, very large gaps in the evidence of meeting the competence requirements. And despite going back and questioning, there just is not enough information to award the applicant the minimum score that they need in order to be successful. Another thing that can be a factor is the applicant not being aware that the assessors will not have access to their quarterly reports. If there's anything that you've done that you feel is relevant, you need to make sure it's stated in the application form. You can sometimes get applicants who get a little bit belligerent when they realise the interview isn't going their way because they have assumed that election is going to be automatic, and that's absolutely not the case. That's the whole purpose for having the professional review interview. We sometimes get applicants who just don't prepare well. They just haven't read the guidance notes for the interview. They haven't thought about how they're going to answer the questions that are put to them, and they're just, on paper they look okay, but when you chat to them face to face, they just don't meet the requirements. Body language can also be a factor as well. So you can see, for example, today that the lighting isn't terribly good in the office that I have to work from today. Where this a face-to-face interview, I'd move to a different location in my home and make sure the camera angles were better. So make sure you're conscious of body language during the interview and how important that is and how important non-verbal communication is. Other thing that can occur is the interviewee doesn't listen to the interviewer, and the minute a topic comes up that they think was going to be covered, they start to embark on a monologue rather than listening to the questions that were asked. And the other thing that's occurred during the virtual interviews is the applicant hijacking the interview and trying to take over and make a presentation. And some of the clangers that we've come across during the past year, thankfully not too many, but no, I haven't read the code of conduct, but I will. Or, what code of conduct? Code of conduct will definitely come up as a question, so make sure your developing engineer is familiar with it. Another one we've had is ethics. No, I don't really do ethics in my role. Another one is my mentor said if I showed up, I'd be fine. And answering with acronyms. Bear in mind the assessors may be from totally different industry sectors, so you need to make sure you explain the acronyms fully. Another one is applicants who think that CPD doesn't apply to them. CPD, of course, applies to everybody, and an applicant has to show how they plan to keep up to date. Do you want to add to that, Anne, at all?
Just that I've noticed that the panel chairs these days are often asking questions about ethics. They're asking if the candidate, the applicant, has had an ethical dilemma at some point in their career that they've had to deal with. So it's good that if you have had experience, it's perfectly okay for the candidate to say, no, actually in my role, I've not had any ethical dilemmas since I started work. It's perfectly okay. But it's quite good that if they have an example that they can share at that point. And there are some questions which are just about always going to come up. There'll be one about ethical dilemmas. There'll be one about the code of conduct. There'll be one about continued professional development. And there is usually one about health and safety and one about sustainability. So these are 5 questions that it's very helpful if the candidate has thought about them beforehand. They are the sub-competencies in competence E, so they are there on the application form. If the candidate has, the applicant has addressed those prior to coming to the interview, it just gives them a little bit more confidence, I think. Oh yeah, that was the question I was expecting, here's the answer type of thing.
Great, thanks, Anne. Remedy, I'll just whiz through this very quickly because I'm conscious of time and wanting to allow for questions. So make sure developing engineers are prepared for the interview, thought about their experience, thought about how it relates to the competence requirements. We often suggest that applicants prepare a checklist of all the topics they want to cover during the interview, and they can refer to the checklist at the end of the interview just to bring to the attention of the assessors perhaps any information that was overlooked during the course of the interview. Important as well that applicants understand the function of the professional review interview and read the guidance notes that are issued by our colleagues in membership department prior to the professional review interview. So there's detailed guidance notes on writing up the application form. There's also some detailed guidance notes on preparing for the virtual professional review interview. Also important that applicants are realistic about their levels of experience and responsibility. And also, like we said earlier, prepare. Preparation is key. Think about how you're going to answer the questions that come to you. Think about the supporting documents that you're going to have and have them all to hand during the course of the interview. Just included a couple of tips for the virtual interview here, just so that you have them as mentors to hand to share with your developing engineers. So try to use a headset where possible, turn off notifications, think about bandwidth, and perhaps if you're working in an office or you're doing your interview from your office or from your home, you might want to include a do not disturb sign on your office or door. I've also noticed that in the current edition of PE magazine, there's an article about preparing for virtual interviews. So there may be some tips that you pick up in there as well. And just so that everybody's clear, you don't get the results on the day. The panel makes a recommendation which goes to our professional review committee, and those selected are elected as members of IMechE. And I'm pleased to say that the Engineering Council figures have just recently been released, and IMechE had the largest number of new registrants overall during 2020, which is great news. If an applicant is not successful, he or she can reapply. But do bear in mind the success rate at interview is over 90%, so the vast majority of people are applicants. But like I said earlier, it can be pretty devastating if you're mentoring somebody or if you're a developing engineer who's not successful, hence all the guidance and support that's available to applicants. But ultimately, we encourage applicants to enjoy themselves. It's an opportunity to meet with senior engineers and to discuss their careers. And we regularly run webinars covering tips for interview, and some of those are already recorded and on the YouTube channel. So again, an additional resource that you should be aware of as a mentor, which could be useful for you and indeed your colleagues within your own organisation. And the link to the workshops that we run is on the screen at the moment, covering a huge variety of different topics, and that's been updated all the time as well. And is there anything you want to add to that before we move on to the questions?
No, I think I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much, Sandra.
Great, thanks very much, Anne. So hope that's been useful. Just before we start the questions, diary date, the next Mentor Forum is on the 22nd of June. It's an Ask the Expert session. We've got 4 experts in their field lined up to take your questions on the day, and we'll do that through Teams so that everybody can have their cameras on as well, which I think just makes it a little bit more interactive. So thank you all very much for joining in today. If you have a question you'd like to ask, if you'd like to raise your hand and just come off mute, you can put it to the 4 of us on the panel today, or indeed you can use the chat box if that's easier. So do we have any questions from anybody who'd like to come off mute and put a question to the panel? One of the questions that's been sent in to me is, how many applicants go through the career learning assessment process on an annual basis? Do we have any stats on that, Emma?
I don't at the moment, but it is something I'm looking to capture in the future. However, last year we noted such a huge uptake in the amount of people coming forward for CLA, and I think that's really just getting the word out that it's there, it's available as an option, and obviously empowering you as mentors in company just to support people through. But if you do attend any of the future forums, I'll try and make sure I get that information for some point later this year.
Great, cheers, thanks very much, Emma. Another question here is, how far back in an applicant's experience is deemed acceptable and still applicable to be included in their submission? Anne, do you want to come in on that one?
I think we generally worked around about 5 years. You know, the question of whether something is still a live competence going, 10 years later is a very valid one. Just so we tend to use roughly. It's not a hard and fast rule by any stretch, but round about the 5-year mark is generally where we consider a competence still to be claimable, if you like.
I think as well, I'd probably add to that, Anne, that if somebody has moved into a more managerial position within their organisation, once they can show to us that they wouldn't be able to carry out that role without having the underpinning knowledge that they gained in the technical role they perhaps held previous to it, then they can show that it's relevant and current. I think the issues occur if somebody, for example, did a really interesting piece of technical work 10 or 15 years ago and they want to talk about that in their application form, where that technology, for example, is now completely obsolete. That's when the challenges and problems occur. So that's why we try it at the workshops we run, explain to people exactly what the interview panel are going to be looking for. So I think it's fair to say that everybody's judged on a case-by-case basis, but it really depends on how you put that case forward to us. The question we were asked recently is, what would stop somebody from being invited to a professional review interview? And a case I'm aware of is where somebody had a degree in engineering, but their 5 years experience after gaining that degree was working at a language school teaching English as a foreign language. So it was somebody who got an application form and I think thought, oh, I'll have a go at this, sent it in, and needless to say, they didn't make it to interview because none of their evidence was relevant to being elected as a chartered engineer. So it's very much making sure that the evidence you include in the application form is current and up to date. Anybody got any questions for Alison at all? That was really interesting, Alison, and I know that you're doing, or one of your colleagues is doing a full hour on this topic at a webinar, I think in August, which I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a really important subject, and it's really misunderstood, I think, because, as I said earlier, of a lot of press and media intervention, it's easy to assume that there are more differences than there are. So hopefully the tips that I gave you were useful. They certainly worked for me and the delegates that I work with across all the organisations that I mentioned. And obviously we work with a lot of coaches and mentors as well who've all found them extremely useful.
Great, thanks very much.
Take questions. What's the pause? I had to laugh, Sandra, where you had on that slide, my mentor just told me to turn up and it would all be okay.
Yeah, I've actually had direct experience of that myself, Alison. I had a developing engineer who wasn't successful at interview, and I think when people are not successful, they initially find it very, very upsetting, but once they sort of dust themselves down and brush themselves off, they decide they're going to give it another go. And this particular lady had come to me about 6 months after an unsuccessful interview, and she said, well, I went to the interview and they started to immediately ask me lots of questions, and I'm like, well, yeah, that's part of the professional review interview. And she said, no, but my mentor had told me all I needed to do was show up on the day and I'd be fine. So she was pretty gobsmacked, you know. So I think that's one of the myths out there, you know, that you just have to show up, whereas you have to do a lot more than just show up. You know, you have to make sure you're fully prepared. I can see another question here is supporting documentation. How many supporting documents is a good amount? We've mentioned earlier that a negative is too much. How many is a good amount? What do you think to that question, Anne, please?
I think if you've got 2, maybe 3 documents to share, fine, but 6, 7, 8 is too many, and many candidates don't have any, to be honest. But I think 1, maybe 2 documents is what I would recommend. Yeah, not too many.
And I think you were mentioning a case, Anne, recently where somebody asked if they could share their slides, share a screen with you to show you 1 document, and you could see that there was a lot more.
Yes, it is very off-putting for the panel if the candidate says, can I share a photograph with you? Fine. The photograph comes up and you see that it's with slide 2, and the title slide is PRI presentation pack. You know, so we're straight in there saying, no, I'm sorry, you can't present. If you've got something that's a drawing or a photograph you'd like to share with us to talk us, you know, to describe the work that you're doing, then that would be helpful. But no, you cannot run through a presentation. Yeah.
I have another question here is, will you automatically be invited to the forums or do you need to apply? Yes, I generally send a follow-up note out to anybody who's attended and include details of the next event. So that should happen once you've joined into the forums. They generally are mentioned in places like the news part of the website, but we've currently got something like 9,000 mentors registered, so we can't do a mailing out to everybody because we'd be totally inundated. But do feel free to share details with any colleagues that you think would be of interest and relevance to, because at the next event on Teams we'll have capacity to have up to 250 people attend. So I can see we're just almost getting up to 1:30. Does anybody have any last or final questions that they'd like to come off to mute to put to the panel? You're very welcome to do so. If you do have a question that you don't wish to share with the panel, that's absolutely fine, of course, as well. You can just get in touch afterwards with any additional questions or queries that you may have, and we'll be delighted to help with them then. So in the last minute, does anybody have any other questions they'd like to share with the panel?
Sandra, I can see one question from Di Davis asking about how often the PRC convenes to review the PR applicants.
I missed that one. Thanks very much, Anne. Professional Review Committee currently meets, I think it's about 4 times a year, but they meet virtually as well. So the time that, and at the Professional Review Committee, they have to discuss the recommendations that are made by all of the interview panels globally, but in particular they focus in on any of the cases where the recommendation of the panel has been that the applicant is not recommended for interview. So the time between sitting your interview and getting the results can vary enormously depending on when the professional review committee meets. But my colleagues in membership are normally able to advise you on how long it will take. So if you're fortunate in that you do an interview very close to a professional review committee meeting, it can be just a matter of a couple of days or weeks before you get the results. Whereas if you do an interview shortly after a professional review committee meeting has taken place, it can take up to 12 weeks before you get the results from your interview. But our colleagues in membership are able to keep applicants up to speed with where they are in terms of getting the results. Does that answer the question? I didn't actually see that question, Anne, sorry. Does that answer that question okay?
I was just waiting for Di to come back. I thought you'd maybe respond to it.
Okay.
Yes, thanks. Good.
Okay, that's great then, super. Okay, just after 1:30, we agreed at the start with the mentor forums, we keep them to exactly an hour so that people could just dip in, spend an hour of their time with us and leave with something useful. Well, I hope we've achieved that goal today. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I do hope it's been useful. And a special thanks to our guest presenters, Alison, Emma and Anne. Thank you all very much for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. And I will circulate a copy of the slides and a summary of the main Q&A in the next couple of days when I get a chance to pull them together. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Do hope it's been useful and look forward to seeing you at the next forum on the 22nd of June.